This is Idiot with a Library Card, and on today's show, I'm going to talk about Invisible Man. If you were hoping for a podcast about H.G. Wells' sci-fi classic, I'm sorry to disappoint you, but I am talking about Invisible Man by Ralph Ellison, and I would have to say a superior book to Invisible Man by H.G. Wells. And it's not like I haven't read the H.G. Wells classic or even dislike it. It's a nice short novel about a person who does not have a great quality of character, who turns himself invisible by some sort of chemical compound and becomes evil, terrorizes a small town in England. H.G. Wells' The Invisible Man is a fine read, and I'd recommend it if you're into books like that. It's a nice beach book or something quick. It's a small novel, so it's a small novel with not a lot of hard ideas or it's hard to digest. It's just a story about a jerk that turns himself invisible and then becomes more of a jerk and terrorizes a small town in England. And as you can tell, the two titles of these books are technically different. One is The Invisible Man, that's the H.G. Wells novel, and the other one is Invisible Man, and that is the Ralph Ellison book. The H.G. Wells novel would be rather easy to talk about and would probably consist of a 5 to 10 minute show. There isn't much there. Again, it's a fine novel if you're into sci-fi type novels like that. It's a nice Twilight Zone episode of a book. On the other hand, Ralph Ellison's Invisible Man is a book that is really hard to talk about, and you're gonna have to trust me on this because this is my third attempt at doing a show on this book. I've tried a few different angles, and you may get a few more shows about this novel. It's really deep and dense. It's got a lot of different ideas it's playing with, and it's a classic. I really love it. And that's the first thing I want to push is this book is a must-read for everyone. I am upset at my school system, my school district, for not forcing me to read it senior year. It's about a high school senior level of reading, maybe a little early college level of reading. It's not an easy book to read, but it's not a terribly difficult book to read. And it's got some really great, interesting themes, and it's just a terrific book all around. It's so well written, and it's interesting, and it really does capture, especially for a young man, but I'm sure young women would also get a lot out of this book. It does really capture that angst of, your late teens, early 20s. It captures that angst and optimism and yet pessimism of that time in your life, or at least it did for me. The thing is, and I want to be careful because all the things I read about the book before I read it, and I didn't read much about the book before I started reading it, but I read the back of the book. I watched a few videos on sort of the general themes it's going to cover. I would suggest not reading anything, even not listening to this podcast until you've read the book. Go to your local library, check this book out. The book was written in 1952, and although it's a classic, I think it's a lesser-known classic. It's certainly a lesser-known classic than it should be, so it's probably available at your library, because again, classic book, old. It's a book every library should have. Frankly, if you go to your library and they don't have it at all, maybe it's checked out for some weird reason, but if they don't have it, demand they get it, because this is a classic book that every library in America needs to have. And this is how much I really love this book and understand the importance of the book. I don't always love books that are said to be important. It's just this book's important, and then you read it and you have to look for all these messages without just sitting back and enjoying the novel and letting the messages make themselves apparent. This book, the messages do make themselves apparent, and it's just so well written. It's a classic. It's one of those books that you read, and while you're reading it, you completely understand that this is a great novel. It's a great all-time novel. And you have a few books. I don't know. I'm trying to think of a few other. Obviously, I love Confederacy of Dunces, and that has that same sort of feel where it's just a great novel. You just read it and you go, oh, this is a masterwork. And this is Ralph Ellison's masterwork, as he really never wrote another novel. He's had 2 published posthumously, which I think I butchered that word, but you know what I mean. After he was dead, he had 2 novels published, but they weren't finished, and someone had to edit down like a 2,000-page manuscript into a 300-word novel, and I haven't heard great reviews or that this novel is all time like Invisible Man. So this is the only novel Ralph Ellison's ever written, and it's amazing because the novel is so great. It's such a great American novel. So because I think this novel is best gone into with as little known about it as possible, stop the show now, go to your library, get the book out. It's not a short novel, but it's not too long of a novel. If you are determined, you should be able to finish it within a month. If you're just reading like a chapter a night, it's just terrific. It's such a good novel. So I can't recommend it enough. So I'm going to recommend this novel. I'm going to recommend it now, and that you read it before you listen. Okay, did you finish reading it? So first off, this book has been frustrating because it's nice to talk to people about books. I mean, this is one of the reasons I do this podcast, is I like talking about books, and sometimes it's hard to find other people who read a lot of books and have, you need someone to read a book to talk about it. You can explain it to someone, but it's not as interesting as when you read it. And this is one of those books I've had trouble finding anyone else who's read it, which is a shame. But also, I really want to talk about this book with someone. I want to conversate with this book. So this is going to be an early plug for the podcast, but I'm averaging like 200 people listening a month, which is amazing. I know it's not a very big number for the internet, but it's a big number for me, and I appreciate everyone who's listening. I know I'm kind of hard to get. I don't have social media accounts attached to this podcast because, frankly, I'm just not that interested in social media. So if you want to talk about the book or you have some comments about the book, you can always email me. And I know this is like a grandpa thing to say email now, but it's the name of the show, idiotwithalibrarycard@gmail.com. I'd love to hear from you, what you think about the podcast, what you think about the book especially, or what you think about other books I've done shows on. I am dying for comments from people who are listening to this podcast on how I can improve it, what books you might recommend. So now that that's out of the way, and again, would love to hear from all of you. This book is now in my top 10, and this book, and this is going to sound very dramatic, this is one of those books that makes me glad I'm alive, but more so, I'm just glad that I'm reading new books. Again, this book was written in 1952, so it's not a new book, but it's new to me, and it's great. I get a little cynical with books sometimes because if you read a lot, it's like watching a lot of movies. You start to pick out all the problems. When I'm doing this podcast or when I'm reading books for this podcast, part of what I need to do is criticize the book. So I do really nitpick all these books, and I'm generally not surprised by books. I read a book and I go, that was good. I really liked it. This book had a real effect on me. This book made me realize just how much I love reading. It's really reinvigorated my love for reading. And again, I know I'm just like slobbering all over this book, but it's just so good. I think like 5 or 6 years ago, I read Catch-22 for the first time, and this book and that book had the same sort of effect where I'm just so happy I'm doing this podcast because it opens me up to reading books. I probably would have gone a longer time without reading this book, but it kept popping up on book lists that I look up to see what would be a good book to do, and it seemed like the book, the internet was telling me to read this book for whatever reason, just books I kind of wanted to talk about or types of books I wanted to talk about. This book kept popping up on lists, so I was like, I guess it's time to read it. And I did, and I could not be happier that I did. So why do I like this book so much? I mean, obviously it's an important question because I've been nothing but saying good things about the book, and this review is going to keep it, but I think if you read the book, it will be fun to talk about and see where you agree and disagree. So first off, the writing itself is really great, and there's something about this book, and it's one of the reasons I've had trouble talking about it. The writing really reminds me of James Joyce. And it's hard to explain how it reminds me of James Joyce. This is one of the things where I probably would need to go to school and get like a degree in literature and then come back and tell you guys how this book is like James Joyce. It just has the feeling of James Joyce. It really reminded me of a book I've read the book twice, and I am blown away by the book, but it's such a tough book to get through, and that's Ulysses. And generally Ulysses is considered the greatest novel ever written. I think it's the greatest novel ever written if you have a degree in literature. It's such a dense book with all sorts of different writing styles and interesting things done by James Joyce. But it's one of those books that you'll never understand unless you have a study guide next to you or you're looking up every chapter and what this word means in that word. So it's a great book, but it's a hard book to penetrate. What I like about this book is I think it does a lot of the same sort of things Ulysses does, but it's a clearer book. And I don't know if that's because of sort of the language barrier. I know that sounds weird. James Joyce was Irish. The book was obviously written in English, but his Irishness in the book can make it very tough to read. And he has some chapters where he changes sort of the language conventions. He'll write in like older English, and then he'll write in like Dublin slang. And so there's all these interesting things going on, and it can be hard to sort of bang through. So I would say the writing style isn't quite... The writing style is similar to Joyce in some ways, but the story and the sort of progression of the story, sort of the episodic chapters, are what really reminded me of Joyce, if I had to put it down. But and again, this is so hard to explain, but the feeling of the book, and books have tone and feeling, and the feeling and tone of the book really does remind me of Ulysses. And the other thing was, and actually what's cool, and I like when I figure this stuff out before I research it, is after I read the book, I did a little more research on Ralph Ellison, because I found it very interesting that he's only written this one book, and it's just so amazing. You look and go, why haven't you written another book? This book was so great. Apparently he was a complete perfectionist, and I think this book, because he's done interviews where he's like, I'm happy with the book, it's okay, but it's not like, I wish I would have done it better. And you read it, and it's on like, it usually makes like the top 20 of like greatest novels written in the 20th century. So you kind of go, well, how good of a book do you want to write, guy? And apparently he could just never get his second novel right. It makes a little bit of sense if you're young and sort of forced to publish a novel. Someone looks at you and goes, dude, the novel's ready, just publish it. But when you can kind of set your own terms, you can then say, no, the novel's not ready, and it'll be ready when I say it's ready, and then you never write another novel, and they have to take your notes after you die and publish a book you might not have published anyway. So listen to your young authors that first book will probably be forced to be published even if you don't think it's ready. But the next ones you will have control over. If any of you are sitting on a masterpiece, that's probably how your career is going to go with all those great novelists who are listening to this show. So a warning for you. But yeah, the book is just, it's so much fun to read. And I'll get into the sort of second thing. It has to do with the writing, but it's something I've never really seen a book do so well. And that's the tone of the book is very fluid. Now, I generally like consistent tone, and tones move in books, but I like a gradual hill. And, a gradual uphill, gradual downhill. Like, I like the tone to change. I mean, obviously tones need to change, but I don't like, the cliffs of a tone where you're, everything's great, and then all of a sudden you've taken 2 steps and you're reading the book, and it's like Wile E. Coyote, where the tone is uplifting and happy, and all of a sudden you realize you're standing over a cliff and then drop like a rock. I tend not to like novels that have tones that do that. And this book sort of does it, but it's so janky. The tone moves from like line to line, and it works because you're in the mind of someone, and you're in the mind of an angry, although it doesn't quite start angry, kind of a naive 20-something-year-old male. And being at one time a naive 20-something-year-old man, your emotions really, you haven't mastered your emotions yet. So the fact that the book is from that angle, the emotions move really quick and the tone moves really quick, but it does it in such an interesting way in that you don't feel like you're getting whiplash. The only way I can explain it is I'm using software right now. It's called Audacity. Audacity is the software I use to record this show, and I think a lot of podcasters use it. I can see the sound waves. I can see my voice, and I can see how loud and quiet it gets at times and how inconsistent I am in every little dumb breath I take. But the way the book works is the tone, the way, just if you've ever seen sound waves, there's an up and a down. And I'm not a scientist in acoustics, so I don't quite understand it all. But imagine a sound wave. It starts as a whisper, and you can see that sound wave, and it grows. It exponentially grows until a scream, and the sound wave starts to go up and down quicker and quicker. And that's how this novel works, is that at first the tone is consistent but moving from happy to sad, from angry to content. And as the novel gets on, and as our main character has more trials and tribulations and gets more disillusioned, is usually the word used, gets more disillusioned, or actually in some ways gets more cynical, the tone starts to bounce up and down much quicker and much more shockingly, but you understand why. And it just works. It's a hard thing to explain. Again, I really think you should read this book, and I think you'll get what I'm talking about, in that the tone starts to move quicker and quicker. And in a way, it is a gradual buildup to that sort of constant crazy tone of happy and sadness. And you really feel all the emotions the author or the protagonist has, the unnamed protagonist. The protagonist is unnamed in it. I've never read a novel that handles tonal shifts and a character's fluctuating emotions so well. I've just never read a novel that captures the angst and anger of that being a young man. The other book I would compare it to is The Catcher in the Rye. The difference is I hate The Catcher in the Rye. Like, I hate our main character in The Catcher in the Rye. I find him to be some rich kid jerk. In this, I like our character. I'm rooting for him. And spoiler alerts, I feel really bad about how he ends up, because it's something I can see that happens to a lot of people. This book has something to say, and I know most books do, but this book is about race in America. It's about the right to be heard. It's about finding yourself and the person you are and the person you want to be and how to go about that. There are a lot of themes of racism in this book. And sorry, guys, for just sort of talking up the book and not explaining it. Me just talking about it and you not reading the book, it's really hard to grasp. I was at a family dinner. I was trying to explain it to people who haven't read the book, and very smart people, and people I really know how to talk to, and I really speak their language because it's my family. As I was trying to explain it to them, I couldn't quite get out what the book was about, and they looked at me and was like, "Oh, that's nice, Bennett. Could you stop talking about books? Let's talk about something nicer." One of the themes is racism, and they do this sort of Southern racism. So our character is the valedictorian of a school. It's a segregated school, obviously, because it's 1950, and he's in Alabama. So he gives this amazing speech at his graduation because he's the valedictorian. Everyone's blown away about it. He's going to give a speech at what he thinks is like a dinner for the influential white folks, the powerful people in the town he grew up in. He goes to this dinner and finds out that a bunch of the boys from his school have to fight each other for the entertainment of these white folks. He's like, okay, I guess I'll give my speech after the fight. And they pull him aside and say, while you're here, could you participate in the fight? And he's like the smartest kid in school and not Mr. Fight, and he doesn't really want to do it. And what he's really worried about, and this is more of a be in the fight if he wants to give his speech, and he feels like being in the fight would make it so his speech would be less taken seriously, which it obviously is. He's in the fight, he gets beat up, he gets a few shots in too, and then they make him give his speech, and he talks about like his mouth filling up with blood as he's giving the speech. He can barely talk, and that while he's giving the speech, all the powerful white people who were just so involved in the fight. They were all rooting, they were all yelling terrible things at the fighters and all that. He then has to give the speech, and they could care less. But after he gives the speech, he gets a scholarship to a university, although the university is unnamed, or if it is named, it's a fake name. It's the Tuskegee University. It's obviously the Tuskegee College. If you don't know about the Tuskegee College, go look it up. Look up Booker T. Washington if you're unaware of his work, because he's an amazing man, and if you're unaware of his work, you really should take some time to read about it, because it's just really interesting, and the time he came along is an interesting time in the South, and what he did with his university is really interesting. He gives the speech, they're impressed with him, and they give him a scholarship to this college. Not only that, they give him a nice leather briefcase, which is kind of important throughout the story. It will be one of the things that will follow him all around until it doesn't. So it sort of explains the brutality of Southern racism. He goes to school. He gets kicked out for taking around a white benefactor of the school. He gets in charge of driving around a white benefactor of the school. He takes him to some places in which there's incest and there's all sorts of rowdiness. Like, he takes him to this old farmer's house who, for lack of a better term, raped his daughter and got her pregnant. It's a really awful story. It's supposed to represent sort of the ugliness of how some of the blacks were forced to live in the South. And the rape of the daughter is sort of explained in that way. And then he has to the benefactor's so shocked by this story, he then has to take him to a bar, which is a black bar in the South where there's a bunch of veterans. And this is important for the overarching race talk of this book and when it was written. And I may get into that later, but I don't feel quite comfortable talking about it now just because I don't have enough information about it. But basically, there was an idea that race relations were going to get a lot better after World War II because so many black people served, and there was this big push by people to say, hey, you know what, if we come together as a nation and sort of get rid of all this racism, because that's Nazi stuff. Racism is something the Nazis do, and it's something we shouldn't do anymore. There was a real belief that after World War II, things were going to get a lot better for black Americans, and it just didn't happen. They came and served, and then they came back, and things weren't better for them, and in some ways worse in some aspects. And it was shocking, and it took a while to be like, okay, never mind, you guys lied to us, and we're going to have to now fight for our rights. But yeah, so there's a lot of black veterans at this bar, and then things get out of control at the bar. He has to get whiskey. He's in the car. He wants to leave the rich white man in the car, but the bartender won't let him, so he has to bring him in, and all this shocking things happen. Basically, he gets back to school with this white guy, and again, if you've read the book, you know what I'm talking about. The white guy's so shocked, he needs to go to his hotel room and rest, and the headmaster hears of all this little adventure and that he took him to see the ugly part of black America. Now, the headmaster is black, because again, it's the Tuskegee University or college. I'm not sure what it's called. Oh, they don't name it in the book. So they get back to campus. The headmaster gets a hold of them. The headmaster's furious, and the headmaster kind of explains that the way he's sort of grown up and held this position, he's never going to give this position up. And stupid things like this are what's going to get him to lose this president of the college. So he basically expels the student, but sort of lies to him and says, I'm going to send you up north to New York. And then, if you show me that you can get a job and get some money and do some good, I'll let you back in the university. But he has no intention of letting him back into the university. Our main character, our protagonist, and I keep saying protagonist because he doesn't have a name in the novel. It's like the one thing I don't like about the novel, because I've read a few books where the protagonist doesn't have a name. This one's done at times a little bit clumsily, it feels like. And again, I don't like saying bad things about this book because this is an all-time book. It's the one thing, there are a few scenes where they sort of point out that, hey, by the way, if you haven't noticed while reading this book, your protagonist doesn't have a name. And at times, I'm one of those people who I like shorter novels and novels that are quick to the point, or novels that don't waste time. And the only thing I find wasteful about this novel is I feel like Ralph Ellison was really happy with the fact that the protagonist doesn't have a name, and he really needs to point it out to you. And it's one of those things where you get immediately that the protagonist doesn't have a name, but there's just a few scenes where it's like, okay, we get it. The protagonist, you're not going to name the protagonist. He actually has a name. He gives his name out to people, but they never say his name in the novel. And Ralph Ellison points that out in his writing, and it's a little redundant at times, but it really is the only complaint I have about the book. I think in my notes, I wrote, I get it, the protagonist doesn't have a name. So it's actually the only complaint I have about the novel is the fact that the protagonist doesn't have a name is pushed a lot, almost too much. So back to the story. He's forced to go up north, and now you see a different type of racism against our main character. And the racism is, it's weird. There's sort of two bits of racism. First off, he gets a lot of racism from his own people, and there's a fight of, and there's a bunch of different leaders and sects up in. He goes to Harlem, by the way. And Harlem in 1950s was sort of the epicenter of black culture. But he goes there and he's amazed that he asks a police for or he looks lost and a police officer stops him and he thinks, oh shit, I'm gonna get beaten, or they're gonna tell me to get off the sidewalk. And they basically ask if he's lost, and he says, yeah, I'm trying to get here. And they give him directions, and they're more respectful than had he been stopped by a police officer in Alabama. So when he gets up north, he's like, oh, this place is great. But then you start to see the racism is kind of twofold. There's a racism from his own people, but there's a racism from organizations that want to use him not as someone who is good at things. He ends up becoming a great orator. Now, this is foreshadowed. He's a really good orator. That's how he gets to college, is he makes a really good speech. He starts speaking on behalf of people. Now, I am skipping over a bunch of things in the novel, but this show's already getting kind of long, so I want to just get this point across. And so a communist organization, they call themselves the Brotherhood, are going to use him to be a speaker in Harlem, and he's going to run the Harlem office to recruit more black folks, basically. One of his friends is killed by a police officer. He gives a speech, and the speech is about breaking down the system, but a lot of it's about race. And the Brotherhood doesn't like that because they like his black face. They like that they can use it to represent them, but they don't like that he's talking about race. It's a problem for them, and really they want to use the black community for their own ends. And that's an important part, is they want to use the black communities for their own ends, but they want to use him for his own ends. They don't care about what he's trying to become or the person he's trying to be. They only care about what they can squeeze out of him. So this is the theme of race in America, and it's really interesting, and I wanted to cover it because I don't want to be one of those people that minimizes that part of the book. But what's cool about the book is it's about that. It's about race in America. It's about race in America in the 1950s. But the book is about so much more. And again, not that like a book about being about race in America in the 1950s or being about race in America generally wouldn't be an interesting book. There's tons of books out there that are really well written and very interesting. But this book does something that just blows me away, in that it's one of those books I wished I had picked up 10 years ago, where I picked up 10 years ago and read it today. And there's certain books in my life that I have that, where I read it 10 years ago and I was just like, oh my God, or read it like gosh, it's getting to be 15 years ago now that I could say, I read that book 15 years ago. And, I didn't start really reading until I was 15. So I guess now I can say I read that book 20 years ago, and this is how I felt about it then. And now that's how I feel about it. This is why I wish I had read the book when I was like in high school or just coming into college, because I think I would have gotten it would have just been interesting to see how I felt about it, because that's the age of the protagonist, and I can feel the protagonist's optimism, yet his cynicism at that time. I really relate it to the protagonist in that way. And so what I like about the book is the subject of the protagonist and what happens to him, and just the universal themes, the coming of age, the big plans, the I'm going to change the world type feeling. And then, and this is probably my favorite, he ends up being wronged by like two major organizations. He's wronged by his college. When the president sends him up north, he gives them letters to get jobs, and the letters actually do the opposite. The letters are like, this guy is not reputable. Don't hire him, or hire him. I don't care. If you want to do a favor to the college, hire him, but he's never coming back to school. When he was promised if he worked hard, he would come back to school. But basically, the president wants to get rid of him without any sort of controversy, so he just sends him up north and says, give these letters out, but don't read them. And the last person he gives the letters out feels bad for him and lets him read the letter. And basically the letter is, don't hire this guy. So he sort of plots revenge against the college president. And then when his organization dumps him and does him wrong, he plots revenge. And I can so relate the first few jobs I had, or when I was younger and someone did me wrong. You have revenge fantasies, and you're going to get back to these people, and you're going to get back at the major institutions that screwed you. And as you get older, you begin to realize that, oh, no, sometimes, as my dad said, I'm sure my dad's going to love that I make this quote public, sometimes you got to grab your ankles. And it's just, but when you're young, you can't accept that. Like, you can't accept that anyone's ever going to put something over on you. And if they do put something over on you, you're going to pay. And it just works so well. And the book ends, this might be my other problem, but actually, the more I think about it, the more I think it's a good ending. It's a cynical ending. But basically, the ending of the book, he ends up being disappointed and disillusioned. And that's when he becomes the Invisible Man. And we all feel like that at times. And especially in our early 20s, where we're going to take on the world and we're going to change things and we're going to make the world so much better. And the things don't go our way. No one cares what we have to say. And no one is looking for our opinion. And you start to feel invisible. You start to feel unheard, and just no one caring about who you are or what you do. And so the book has themes of that, the fighting against big institutions and losing, or not even, like, it's like a mosquito biting a giant where it doesn't even register to the giant. I really like that theme in the book because I can relate to it. And also the theme of being disappointed and disillusioned. And you can see the protagonist grows. He becomes more cynical and more disillusioned with the world. But he also realizes, because he tries to pull his identity from other sources, from the college he goes to, from the organization he works for, from the jobs he has. And none of that stuff gives him his personality. None of it gives him his meaning. And when he becomes invisible, because it ends up a bunch of things happen. And again, this show has run way longer than I wanted it to, but this book is so dense and hard to talk about. I knew it was going to be a word salad and me just rambling on for points, because you just need so much context when talking about the book. But at the end of the book, basically there's a large race riot that the Brotherhood is kind of responsible for, and he's a little responsible for. He's running around. There's all sorts of fighting with a rival group, and he falls into a manhole and just realizes that his fight is over, that he's not going to get back at the Brotherhood, he's not going to get back at his college president, and that those things aren't going to be what forms him anyway, and that he's now figured out that sitting in this dark hole by himself, being invisible, this is where he's going to find himself. And there's a lot of, you find yourself from within, I think is one of the ending themes of the book. It's something I had trouble seeing other analysis of the book saying that, but that's sort of how I feel the book ends up being resolved. Because at the very end of the book, he becomes the invisible man, meaning a man not seen by society. But in that personality, he finds himself and who he actually is and who he wants to be. Because you can't get your self-worth or your identity from other things or people. You sort of have to figure that out for yourself. And it's something that and this is the last sort of point of the book is, and I know as a young person, you see it all the time now, you want to get your identity from like your, sexuality or race. And I see a lot of young people trying to get their identity from that, or your identity from like a political party or a hobby you have or something like that. And really your identity is something you have to personally work hard to bang out, to craft. And I think that is one of the ending messages of the book, sort of the positive side of, everyone's going to ignore you. You can't fight big institutions alone. And you might come in with an upbeat and naive to a certain point attitude. And by the end of, fighting or trying to change things, you'll end up being disillusioned and cynical and walking away from those fights like that. But that in those fights, you'll find yourself. And if you work on finding yourself in sort of a dark room alone is kind of the theme. If you really want to think about what you want to be and who you want to be, that's the way to find yourself. And you can't get your identity from other people, and you can't get your identity from other organizations. So yeah, Invisible Man by Ralph Ellison is an absolute must read. Again, if you listen to this podcast all the way through without reading it, fine. I hope you kind of understood what I was talking about. But again, it's such a great book. I think you should totally read it. Get it from your library. If your local library doesn't have it, email me, and I'm going to send a nasty email to your local library because they freaking should have this book. So thanks for listening. Sorry this show was a little long, and also that it's been a while since I've published a new show. It's been hard. I had COVID in December, and Christmas came, and still sort of catching up from that. So I'd like to try to get a show out every 2 weeks. We'll see how that goes. I tend to average once a month, and I'm behind on that even. So as I said in the last show, Dan Carlin's become an inspiration. I guess he's become an inspiration on how often I get my shows out. So sorry, Dan, I didn't want to take a shot at you. Thanks for listening. Read Invisible Man. It's a great book. Please like, subscribe, and comment wherever you get your podcasts. Again, if you want to talk about this book, and I'm so dying to talk to people about this book, just email me at idiotwithalibrarycard@gmail.com. And I'd love to have discussions and maybe suggest, I don't want to use social media too much, but maybe suggest the best way I could reach my fans. And I guess if I could call people who listen to the show fans, let me know what you guys think. The best way I could improve the show, the best way I could engage with people who are listening to the show. So thanks for listening. And hopefully another show will be coming out in 2 weeks, but probably be like 2 months.